The gospel lesson this morning comes out of St. John. I want to say thank you to Maria, too, for sitting in the dead zone. I don't know what is wrong with these pews, but I appreciate someone being there to balance us out. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him. He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have just a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves. He gave thanks. He distributed it to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them, filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. All in all, it can be a little overwhelming if you think about it. If we count everyone who lives on this planet, those near and far, 7.4 billion of us. But if you focus in closer to home, here in the Houston, Baytown, Sugar Land metropolitan area, the 5th largest in the country, last year, 6.6 million people. And more than 700,000 of those folks live right here in Fort Bend County, with at least half of them in front of you on Highway 6 whenever you're on it. So when we talk about being good neighbors to those around us, we've been speaking about that these past few weeks. Well, it's easy to be taken back by the potential immensity of the sheer numbers of people who are involved. Because as we saw earlier, Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. Our neighbors, not only those who live around us or who may look like us or may talk like us, are there anyone and everyone who may need our love and attention? So how in the world are we supposed to reach 700,000 people? Much less the 7.4 billion people, men, women, and children, who make up our global community. Well, the answer is we do it with baby steps. That is, we take what we have, we give it to the Lord, and then we plunge in head first. You see, that was clearly the dilemma that the disciples faced that day, when after an exhausting time of ministry, they found themselves with the rather unenviable task of providing an unplanned dinner on the grounds for more than 5,000 folks. So the disciples did what you and I would probably have done as well. According to the other 3 gospel writers who tell this story, they tried to head the problem off by suggesting, "Master, don't you think it's time to send everybody home now?" Go on. Show's over. Nothing to see here. Move along. But of course, Jesus didn't do that. St. John tells us, in fact, here in chapter 6, Jesus had already determined he was going to use this occasion of a potential food fight of epic proportions to test the disciples by asking them, where are we to buy bread to feed these people? And that was a pretty good question. Jesus and his uninvited guest were at the farthest shore of the Sea of Galilee. That means they were over on the eastern side of the lake. They weren't close to a town at all, but if it was, it would have been maybe Bethsaida, far over there. That means there weren't a whole lot of Kroger's or H-E-B's, Hebrews Eating Bread, or Exxon stations with those little overpriced little Debbie cakes you can get there. There certainly would have been unspoken questions then, even if there had been such places. The unspoken question, which always arises in any church's discussion of any idea for any program or any activity, namely, how are we going to pay for it, preacher? I know the gospel writers don't dwell on this, but I also know that being good proto-Methodist, those disciples were thinking about the money. After all, the treasury of the little band was not exactly brimming over, especially given the master's rather questionable choice of Judas as the fellow to hold the money bags. It may have been summer. You know how it goes. Summer in the church, people go on vacation, take their offerings with them, yada, yada. So the question which Jesus asked them was really kind of a ridiculous thing to say, wasn't it? Jesus said a lot of ridiculous things, at least from our perspective. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in fact, all tell us that Jesus said to the disciples, you give them something to eat. Go ahead. You give them something. And you can hear the disciples, can't you? Remote location. 5,000 or more people, because the 5,000 was just the men, so there were women and children too. Everybody hungry. Sun going down in the sky, the sermon ran over. No obvious plan on the horizon for how they could be fed. But then the plans of Jesus are often not all that obvious to you and me. Verse 6 tells us Jesus himself knew what he meant to do. That is to say, he wasn't confused. He had a plan, a perfect plan, a divine plan, as he always did. He just hadn't bothered to tell those poor disciples what it was. Don't you hate it when the sovereign Lord of the universe doesn't clue you in as to what he's doing? Look, if you will, at what was said in those miraculous moments that followed. Philip, he was sort of the CPA of the group. He set out to calculate the cost of feeding those people. He said, this is going to be about 8 months' wages. Andrew, who was the hometown fellow from the next village, closest village, which would have been Capernaum maybe, he volunteered, if only halfway optimistically, well, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Opsaria is the Greek word. It refers to dried or pickled fish. Yum. But then what is that among so many? I wonder if Andrew had the foggiest notion of what he was saying when he expressed unto Jesus, there is a boy here. He said that kind of sums up, when all is said and done, the first lesson Jesus had in mind when he gave his disciples that little impromptu pop quiz by the sea. No matter what the emergency, no matter how it looks on the surface of things, we ought to remember that when Jesus is involved, there will always be a boy there. Or if not a boy, some other tangible expression of God's provision, no matter what the circumstances would suggest to us. Now, we don't know this boy's name. Let's just call him Junior. I'm not sure any Hebrew kid was ever called Bubba, so let's go with Junior. We don't know whether Junior was just a little kid whose mother had sent him out to play with a sack lunch under his arm, or whether he was a young peddler who thought he could make some money by selling a few loaves of barley bread, a couple of dried fish. We don't know if he was a servant whom the disciples might have hired to carry the food that they intended to have for a private picnic with just Jesus on the beach. We don't know at all what made that little boy bring those loaves and fish that day. Boys often do unaccountable things, don't they? What we do know is that God, who understands even the undiscerning reason and mixed motives of a pre-teenage or teenage boy, God had appointed Junior to be there that day. Jesus is never in need without having someone at hand to supply that need. Now, again, it often defies reason. One kid, 2 dead fish, 5 barley loaves, and 5,000 or more people. You crunch the numbers, they don't work, do they? Which is again why Andrew couldn't help but point out the obvious to Jesus, but what is so little among so many? But you see, when God is involved, sometimes all our rational ways of looking at things don't tell the story. Jesus had a plan for the disciples. The plan involved them. It usually does involve you and me. The disciples just needed to learn how to trust him. You see, secondly, notice what Jesus said. He didn't blurt out, "That's right, Andrew, 1 kid, 2 dead fish, 5 loaves of bread. It's 5,000 people. Stand back. You're going to see one whiz-bang of a miracle." He didn't cry out to the crowds, "Everybody, I get your cameras ready. You're not going to believe what your eyes will see." He didn't signal the disciples, "Call the media. It's Supernatural City one more time." Think Elijah did good feeding those 100 people with just 10 loaves? Watch this. What does the verse 10 tell us? Jesus said. He said simply, "Have the people sit down." I really think we should out of that little directive. It tells us, even if just in passing, that when it came to the supernatural, Jesus' way was yet a calm and orderly one. That's to say, Jesus never endorsed the idea of ministry or even miracles as mere spectacles. He never tried to impress people with his power, to use it to whip them up into some sort of spiritual or emotional frenzy. He never tried to capitalize on his obvious control over nature by making people realize that when it came to doing the impossible, Jesus didn't even know what that word meant. And instead, Jesus generally ministered the dunamis, the dynamite power of God, in clearly demonstrative but also strangely quiet ways. And while I can appreciate people who get all whooped up in their worship, I rather believe this simple observation about the Master's way is worth noting as well. We can go too far in the other direction, yes. We can kill ourselves being liturgically correct and perfectly poised, which will make usually for deadly dull worship services. And we've all been in them, haven't we? I've led many of them. The Lord be with you, and also with you. Lift up your hearts. This is as high as they go, preacher. Not any higher. That's not worship. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am saying is that just as God is seldom honored by worship that is mere rote or habit, he is likewise not generally glorified by our goofiness either. Make the people sit down, Jesus said. For it was only then, John tells us, that Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks, distributed them to the people as they sat there. And when he was finished, everybody had been fed. In fact, everybody had as much as they wanted. Seconds, thirds, fourths, until they were all satisfied. Kortazo is the word in Greek, and it means that they gorged themselves, stuffed themselves silly. They had so much food in abundance that when all was said and done, the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread, far more than they started with. So when, do you suppose, did the miracle happen? Did the disciples have a basket each and went out, and every time they reached down and handed a piece of bread, they looked down and there was another piece there? Did Jesus himself go around to all 5,000, just kept giving it out? I'd really love to know this. How and when did that miracle happen? This is all I know. When those 2 fish and those 5 loaves of bread fell into the hands of Jesus, when they became associated with the Christ, they came in contact with Almighty God himself, and they changed. That's really what the point of this whole miracle story is about, isn't it? What the boy Junior, when he was willing to share his lunch, then the Lord in turn performed a bona fide, genuine miracle. He multiplied 5 small loaves, 2 small fish to feed thousands of hungry men, women, and children who were, at least in the disciples, not all that far away from turning into a really ugly crowd indeed. Now, I know some folks will tell you that there really wasn't any physical miracle that day by the Sea of Galilee, just a spiritual, symbolic one. They'll say that what really happened was when the little boy to whom those fish and loaves belonged gave what he had to the Lord, that it shamed everybody else. It prompted a spontaneous mass display of unselfish sharing as everybody else fessed up and pulled out the secret provisions they had been hiding all along. Look, they said, Junior's giving his lunch to Jesus. I guess I can share my stash as well. I've been hiding a Snickers bar under my robe all day long. I could break it in half if I had to. Isn't that the most lame attempt to explain a miracle away that you've ever heard? The 5,000 votes were satisfied. That means they didn't have a little snack by the seashore. You know how you walk through Sam's Warehouse on a Saturday morning, you just kind of graze going from free sample to free sample. That's not what was going on. They ate until they were full. That's always the way it is with Jesus. When you come to him, you don't get a spiritual snack, you get satisfied. Only before we ever see those kinds of miracles, we have to indeed be willing to give whatever we do have to Jesus so that he can use it. You see, Jesus won't practice multiplication without addition and subtraction and division first. The disciples added up what they had. They subtracted Junior's food from him. Jesus then divided it among the people, and in doing so, the bread and fish were multiplied. So if we want to see Jesus work miracles in our lives, we have to first be willing to trust him with whatever he's already given us. We may say, well, like Andrew, but what is so little among so many? We forget what God can do with little things. We need to stop counting up our resources and start counting on God's provision. Because he can make a miracle out of the minute in our lives. He specializes in taking the ordinary small things that we have or do and turning them into something marvelous and noteworthy. In the book we recommended to you this month, The Art of Neighboring, Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon tell the story of how on September 6, 1995 in Baltimore, an unforgettable moment in baseball happened. It wasn't a walk-off homer. It wasn't a new record for strikeouts. It wasn't the debut of the highest paid free agent in the game. It wasn't even a win streak of more than 4 for the Astros. But millions of people were tuned in to witness one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of sports. The president and vice president were among the 46,000 in the stands. Because on that night, another junior, this one named Cal Ripken, played in his 2,131st consecutive game, breaking a record that had stood for 56 years. And when the game became official in the fifth inning, they stopped the game, and the crowd began to cheer. And they cheered, and they cheered, and they cheered. Not for a singular athletic feat, but for the achievement of sheer endurance, because for 14 straight years, Cal Ripken played in every single game of every single season, whether he was injured, or he was well, or he was sick, or he was hurt, or he was in a hitting drought. It didn't matter. He showed up. He did his job. They shoved him out onto the field. His teammates did. And there at home plate was his wife and his children. He looked up in the stands, and there was his father, Cal Ripken Sr., with tears in his eyes. Then he went back in the dugout, and his teammates pushed him back out, and he walked the victory lap all around the field. He stopped and grasped hands with all the fans, the police, the opposing team. They were all cheering. Just because he showed up. He did his job. He went to work day after day. And he didn't stop at 2,131 games. He went on 3 more years to make it 2,632 games. But he will tell you that the real record might really have belonged to Ernie Tyler, one of the umpires in Baltimore. Ernie Tyler didn't miss a home game for 30 years. My friends, can I tell you that your job and my job this morning as Christians is simply to show up, to go to work, to get involved in this task of loving our neighbors? That is the great commandment God gave us, isn't it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and then love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, it can seem overwhelming. I suspect that if on the very first day in baseball, Cal Ripken had thought about, I think I'll go 2,132 straight games without missing one. I think I'll be at every single game for the next 14 years. That would have seemed kind of overwhelming too. If we start and we say there are 700,000 people who live in Fort Bend County, that's a little overwhelming. You just start with the ones who live by you, the ones with whom you work every day, the neighbors that God has put you around. See, it's the small things that count. It's those baby steps that add up when Jesus starts doing the math in our lives. Now, I don't pretend to know what your neighbors are like. Some of them may be real stinkers. Years ago, my mom called me one day. She was living by herself in her home that she'd been in 40 years. And she said, you know what? The neighbors behind me, they keep throwing grapefruit over the fence. I said, really? She said, yeah, I find it in the backyard all the time. So I just throw them back over the fence. Thought that was odd. So I drove over to her house. And what I found? We had a grapefruit tree. We had a grapefruit tree. It hadn't produced for 30 years. All of a sudden, it started putting out grapefruit. They're dropping on the ground. My mom, 87 years old, is throwing them back over the fence. They're throwing them back over at her. I had to go over and apologize to them for my mother. Sometimes the neighbors are challenging. I am pretty sure among your neighbors, God has already placed his junior. If Jesus is at work, anything can happen. And in the perfect economy of God, when they gathered up the leftovers, nothing was wasted. Do you know, in your life and in my life, there are things which have happened which we would have done our best to prevent if we could have, yet they still happened. Some of them are painful. Some of them were just hard. Some of them we just didn't want to do. But may I tell you, God will not waste any of them. Every experience in your life, good, bad, indifferent, difficult, or easy, God will use if you let him. In his economy, nothing is wasted. Maybe that experience is exactly what you need to be able to relate to that neighbor that seems unrelatable. Why not let him do the miracle of multiplication in your life this morning? Give him what you got. Watch what wonders he will do. Amen.